I recently spoke with an old acquaintance in Tehran, a man who once managed a mid-sized textile factory. He didn't want to talk about the 140 million to 1 exchange rate or the return of the central bank's old guard. Instead, he was strangely fixated on this small, broken plastic gear he was holding. He looked almost mesmerized by it, turning it over in his hands like it was a piece of rare jewelry.
Just the gear itself.
Yeah. He told me he'd spent the entire morning trying to source a replacement, only to find that the local suppliers weren't accepting rial anymore. They wanted industrial lubricant or copper wire in exchange.
Wow. It's pure barter.
Pure barter. He said, "We've moved past the illusion of money. We're finally back to the physical reality of things." And he had this chilling, detached sort of pride about it.
Like it was some kind of clarifying moment for him.
Exactly. He seemed almost energized by it, scrolling through photos on his phone. Not of news headlines, but of his factory floor. He showed me pictures of workers sitting in circles bartering bags of rice for spare machine parts.
So the whole factory floor has become a marketplace.
Right. To him, the total collapse of the currency wasn't a tragedy. It was a moment of brutal honesty. He felt the paper rial had been a lie for decades, and its death was the only way to see what the country actually had left. He was convinced, as long as they had stuff, they could survive.
But there's a catch there, isn't there?
Well, that's when the conversation took a sharp, dark turn. I asked him what happens when the factory's electricity, which had been flickering throughout our video call, finally stays dark for good. His face just went completely slack. The cynical, intellectual excitement vanished instantly. He started talking about the bizarre strikes, and his voice was suddenly sharp with this desperate kind of anger. He snapped, "It's not that the merchants are greedy. It's that the state can't even guarantee the power to run the lights in the market anymore. They're printing more paper to fix a world that is literally breaking apart."
And that's the real story right there.
That sudden shift, from a smug acceptance of the currency's death to the raw terror of realizing the state's physical capacity had simply evaporated, that's what stayed with me. It wasn't just a financial crisis. It was the realization that when a nation's industry and infrastructure go into autopsy, the currency is just the first organ to fail. It makes you wonder, what is a country actually worth when it loses the ability to keep its own machines turning?
That narrative, it immediately grounds our analysis because the collapse of the rial to those record lows, that eye-watering 140 million to 1 figure, it's not merely a financial crisis.
Right.
It is, as you suggested, a financial epitaph. Our deep dive today is focused on analyzing this causal relationship, the one between Iran's deteriorating energy infrastructure and the rial's hyperinflation. We want to use the data to understand why physical state capacity remains the ultimate anchor for currency value, especially in sanctioned economies.
So it's about state capacity, but not in an abstract sense.
Not at all. We are analyzing the currency collapse as the direct monetary projection of a comprehensive failure in that state capacity, that core ability of a government to govern, sustain, and, invest in its own physical reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. So state capacity isn't about political rhetoric or ideological fervor. It's about the most basic mechanics of running a modern nation, the nuts and bolts.
Precisely. The core thesis that ties everything together today is this. The value of money, in the final analysis, is a claim on the real physical output of a society.
Like a warehouse receipt.
Exactly like a warehouse receipt. If the warehouse, the national economy, is empty or decaying, the receipt is worthless. We are looking at why this atrophy occurred and what happens when the productive core of a civilization starts to waste away. The currency isn't the problem. It's the thermometer registering the fatal fever.
I find that story of the broken plastic gear so powerful because it just strips away all the high-level financial analysis and gets right down to the grit. And that brings us to Arash, the metal pressing workshop owner in Isfahan. For him, hyperinflation isn't some abstract economic force. It's a direct physical consequence of decay.
Arash's experience perfectly illustrates this idea that the only true hard currency for a manufacturer is the reliable kilowatt hour.
The kilowatt hour, yeah.
His business, like any industrial operation, it relies on a predictable energy flow. Last summer, with the grid buckling under the heat, those planned blackouts started lasting 6, 8, even 10 hours a day.
And when the power is out?
When the power is out, Arash's massive hydraulic press stands silent. Output drops to zero, his fixed costs remain, and he has fewer physical goods to sell.
So when the power finally flicks back on, the rial has devalued even further because the physical scarcity of manufactured goods, the metal parts he presses, has increased relative to the money supply. This cycle is just brutal.
It's a vicious cycle. The central bank prints money, but the physical decay of the copper wires and the gas turbines removes the physical goods needed to back that money.
That's the critical insight, isn't it? The deteriorating energy infrastructure is the physical anchor of the real hyperinflation.
It is. For the productive economy, the national currency is fundamentally worthless if it cannot reliably purchase the necessary production inputs. And the most critical of those is power. The entire chain of value addition just breaks down at the wall socket.
Now, what's so confounding to an outside observer is that this physical decay is happening in a country that is incredibly resource-rich. We're talking about the world's second largest natural gas reserves. How does that translate into chronic gas shortages? It seems like a fundamental failure of management and, well, investment.
It's what we're calling the gas paradox, and it's a textbook example of how sanctions and structural maintenance failures can cripple even a resource giant. The last South Pars field, which is responsible for about 3/4 of the nation's gas production, has entered the second half of its operational life.
Okay, so it's aging.
It's aging, and as geological pressure naturally declines in these massive fields, you absolutely require massive compressor platforms to maintain flow and output.
And Western sanctions are explicitly blocking access to these highly specialized, high-pressure compressor platforms.
That is the exact mechanism of failure. Because the necessary Western technologies, specifically the specialized turbines and high-capacity compressors, cannot be legally imported or serviced, the production capacity is stalling.
And you can see that in the numbers.
Oh, clearly. The production growth rate from South Pars has slowed to only 1/3 of the rate achieved in the previous decade. Now, when you combine that declining physical output with an exploding domestic consumption profile driven by aging infrastructure, energy subsidies, and new thermal power plants, the structural deficit just explodes.
Let's get granular on the scale of that deficit, the resulting fuel consumption crisis. The source material details this cascading effect where a gas shortage forces a switch to dirtier, less efficient fuels.
The figures are alarming, and they really reveal the depth of the structural hole. The projected gas deficit is expected to hit a staggering 300 million cubic meters per day in peak winter.
Wait, 300 million cubic meters per day?
Per day. To give that some scale, that is roughly equivalent to the entire daily gas consumption of a large, modernized European nation.
Wow.
And this massive deficit forces power plants and heavy industry to abandon relatively clean gas and switch to dirtier, often imported liquid fuels.
And this switch causes a surge in the use of diesel and that heavy fuel oil, mazout, which are both less efficient and, environmentally destructive.
Precisely. We have internal figures showing the consequence. Diesel consumption hit a record 146 million liters per day. But critically, this exceeded national production by about 30 million liters daily.
So they're running a massive daily deficit. They can't meet themselves.
Yeah, a massive structural fuel deficit. Simultaneously, daily mazout consumption climbed 30% as heavy industry and power plants desperately tried to keep the lights on and the machines running. Last year alone, the country consumed 57 billion liters of mazout and diesel. That's over 1 million barrels per day, most of it used incredibly inefficiently.
That inefficiency must translate immediately into the physical output of the nation's key industries. The very industries that are supposed to be backing the currency. What were the specific consequences of cutting industrial supplies?
The state, unable to guarantee the energy, was forced to cut industrial power supplies by half last summer. This wasn't a general slowdown, it was a physical amputation of capacity.
A physical amputation.
And we see the immediate translation in the hard numbers for key industrial output. Take the highly energy-intensive steel sector. Production fell by an enormous 45% in the third quarter of 2024.
45%. Half the industry just vanished.
Steel is one of the pillars of modern industrial economies, and half its capacity disappeared because of a lack of guaranteed power.
Why is steel so sensitive to these power cuts? Is it just about running the machines?
It's the sheer energy intensity of smelting and electric arc furnaces. They require massive, consistent baseload power. When the power flickers or cuts, it's not just downtime. It often means significant material damage or wasted material in the furnace. So a 45% drop signals a catastrophic inability to run the process reliably.
And we see similar drops across other fundamental production sectors.
Oh, absolutely. Cement production dropped 7%, and that figure is expected to get much worse because the state is forecasting an 80% cut in gas supplies to the cement industry in the coming winter.
So no steel, no cement.
you halt construction, you halt infrastructure. If you halt their production, you halt future growth and maintenance. Even the large-scale petrochemical sector, a massive export driver, operated at only 70% capacity. When these core sectors, which together account for 55% of the country's non-oil exports, contract this severely, the currency collapse is inevitable. The rial is just reflecting the physical reality of a state that is producing less and less.
And here's where the analysis of the stopgap measures gets fascinating, because they reveal the state trading physical and environmental health for immediate fuel supply. What are they doing to compensate for this internal structural failure?
They're relying on short-term, expensive, and often dangerous fixes. To meet the massive domestic fuel deficit, the state doubled its fuel imports compared to the previous year, bringing in nearly 5 billion liters of gasoline and diesel.
And since sanctions constrain cash, they can't just pay for those imports on the global market using standard financial rails. They're literally going back to barter, like my acquaintance said.
That's exactly right. They're using their only readily available commodity-heavy fuel oil, mazout, exports as trade currency. We know that 40% of their mazout exports were bartered for refined fuel, primarily with the UAE.
Which is a return to a pre-monetary system.
It's a commodity-backed transaction system where the national currency is bypassed entirely because foreign suppliers trust physical goods oil more than they trust the rial. It is a stunning physical admission of the currency's failure.
Let's talk about the quality of the gasoline itself, because this is where the physical cost is transferred directly onto the public.
This is one of the most critical physical compromises. An internal oil ministry report revealed that Iran doesn't produce any gasoline that fully meets international standards. Around 80% fails to comply with Euro 4 or 5 benchmarks.
So to artificially boost the supply?
To boost gasoline supply and meet desperate demand, they're blending in petrochemical additives.
Specifically MTBE.
Yes. They are blending 2 million liters of MTBE daily. This substance is banned in many countries, including in North America and Europe, due to its severe environmental and health risks, particularly its tendency to contaminate groundwater.
And this isn't a new thing, but it's accelerating.
The reliance on this toxic blending agent reflects a fourfold increase in additive use in recent years. This is the state prioritizing a momentary appearance of fuel sufficiency over long-term environmental and public health stability.
And if we look at the discrepancy between the official spin and the internal data, the political decision-making here seems deliberately misleading.
Oh, it absolutely does. Officials publicly boasted about an 11% overall output growth in gasoline, yet the oil ministry's own confidential report showed that actual growth was closer to 1/3 of what was publicly claimed.
So there's a huge gap.
This gap between rhetoric and reality is the perfect microcosm of the problem. The political class is using monetary and rhetorical levers to project control, even as the physical reality, the fuel quality, the decaying fields, the air quality, tells a story of accelerating structural collapse. The collapse of the rial is just the score sheet for the failure of the kilowatt hour, a failure compounded by systemic deceit.
The story of energy failure provides that physical foundation. Now let's move to the financial response, which, as you said, often seems to be operating in a completely different universe. I keep coming back to the story of Miriam, the young Western-educated economist. Her account of the central bank offices as a surreal bubble of policy simulations is incredibly powerful.
Miriam's experience really highlights the fatal disconnect between what financial policy can achieve and what the physical economy needs. Central bankers, often highly capable technocrats, are trained to manage money supply, interest rates, and currency corridors. But monetary policy cannot conjure industrial spare parts, nor can it generate electricity.
She watched them implement sophisticated monetary tightening while knowing that the underlying economic foundation was shrinking manufacturing, contracted by over 3%. It's the tragedy of using a financial tool to fix a structural
An engineering problem, exactly. The economic data from 2025 just proves her point, confirming the dominance of structural failure over monetary attempts at correction. Manufacturing contracted by 3.4%, mining fell by 2.9%, and overall GDP, when you strip out the volatile oil export sector, fell by 0.5%.
So the physical economy is shrinking.
It's a contracting physical economy. And when the supply of things decreases, any increase in the supply of money only hastens devaluation. You can replace the central bank governor, but you cannot replace a broken technological pipeline with a new policy simulation.
This helps explain the revolving door at the central bank then. The reappointment of former governors, the constant shuffling of leadership. It's a symbolic act, a rearrangement of deck chairs, as the critique mentioned, designed to project stability.
It's a political tactic. It's meant to manage market sentiment, not to genuinely address core structural weaknesses. The focus is on calming the exchange rate, treating the symptom. But the industrial base is hollowed out, and the market, particularly the merchants who deal in physical goods, recognizes this charade.
Which brings us to the physical revolt of the bazaar. Their widespread strikes are much more than a protest over pricing. They're a collective physical rejection of the medium of exchange itself.
It is a declaration of insolvency regarding the national currency. A key insight from the merchants is that closed is cheaper than open.
Why? What does that mean? Closed is cheaper than open.
Well, because the time it takes to sell a good, accept reals, and then attempt to replace that stock, the real has already lost so much purchasing power that the merchant is operating at a guaranteed loss.
So they lose money just by doing business.
The primary function of money to retain value between transactions has vanished. They lose less money by sitting idle than by participating in the market.
They are opting out entirely because the mechanism of exchange is untrustworthy. Meanwhile, the state's financial architecture seems to be actively encouraging capital leakage and corruption, primarily through those subsidized exchange rates.
This subsidized exchange rate system was a fiscal black hole and a massive generator of what we call rent-seeking. This system, which cost the government about $18 billion, was intended to help consumers by providing cheap dollars for essential imports like medicine and basic food staples.
But the reality was vastly different, as President Pezeshkian himself admitted.
He was remarkably frank about it. He stated the government would stop distributing the subsidized $28,500 because, and I'm quoting, anyone who received the $28,500 pocketed. This system created massive arbitrage opportunities. Intermediaries would secure dollars at the subsidized rate, import lower priority goods, or just sell those dollars on the black market for significantly higher profits, benefiting the politically connected and rent seekers instead of stabilizing consumer prices.
That is nearly $20 billion that flowed directly into private pockets without achieving its social purpose, right?
And that failure contributed heavily to the staggering scale of capital leakage and non-repatriation. Since 2018, over $116 billion in export earnings has not been repatriated to the system.
$116 billion.
That money earned by selling physical oil, gas, and petrochemicals should have returned to be exchanged for productive inputs like industrial spare parts, machinery, technology. Instead, it leaked out, largely due to regulatory failures that enabled exporters to avoid their currency transfer obligations. So the industrial sector is starved of the foreign exchange needed for its most basic maintenance, guaranteeing the atrophy we talked about earlier.
The social cost of this failure is just immense. We noted inflation surpassing 50%, yet proposed salary increases are only 20%. That gap is actively impoverishing the middle class.
It is a catastrophic decline in real purchasing power. The average civil servant or retiree faces an unbridgeable 30 percentage point gap. This pushes formerly stable middle-class households into an existential crisis. We see accounts where relatively minor, unforeseen emergency costs, a broken car transmission, a required medical procedure, or a major appliance failure can literally wipe out several months' worth of savings, or, worse, put them into unrecoverable debt. The stability enjoyed by the middle class is completely dissolved, fueled by the government's failure to control inflation.
And when government officials are confronted with this hardship, the defense often shifts the blame to the public, accusing them of wasteful habits.
That narrative, which often tries to justify cuts to subsidies, is factually incorrect, and it ignores the severe constraints the public is already under. Official data directly counters this narrative of excess consumption.
Let's break down the evidence for that. What do the consumption numbers really show?
They show a severely constrained population. Take electricity. Household consumption is about 1,100 kilowatt hours per year. That is 40% lower than the average household consumption in the European Union.
40% lower.
Furthermore, officials criticized excessive consumption of basic commodities like sugar and cooking oil. Yet UN data reveals that the per capita consumption of both is below the global average and significantly lower than in neighboring countries like Turkey. Per capita cooking oil consumption, for instance, is 30% lower than the global average.
So the average Iranian family is not running their air conditioning constantly or consuming extravagant amounts of staples. They're already operating under severe duress.
They are. And this duress is visible in essential food consumption. Per capita, meat consumption has fallen an enormous 40% over the last decade. Dairy consumption is down 30%.
40%.
The average Iranian consumes only 7 to 10 kilograms of meat per year, compared to a global average of 32 kilograms. These figures paint a clear picture of a population already exercising severe constraints due to price inflation. Attempts to shift blame onto the public's supposed wasteful habits are merely a political tactic to mask the fundamental structural failure of the economic and political system to protect its citizens.
It's just clear that the central bank's technocratic maneuvers are futile when the physical base is crumbling and the financial system is leaking capital through politically favored corruption. They are treating a deep systemic infection with a financial band-aid. This discussion of physical contraction and financial leakage really points to a generational strategic failure. This is where the narrative of Farhad, the retired mechanical engineer, becomes so critical. His lament about the erosion of the engineering soul captures the moral and intellectual cost of this economic collapse.
Farhad's story is the emotional heart of deindustrialization. It's not just an economic phenomenon, it's a cultural and professional reversal. He spent his life dedicated to the pride of making things automotive parts, heavy machinery. But he watched his former colleagues and students abandon the drafting table, not because they lacked skill, but because the skills of a designer or a builder were financially devalued.
They shifted from being producers to speculators. They're using their advanced mathematical and technical intelligence to day trade currency or flip imported goods rather than design engines or build bridges.
The country is shifting from a productive engineering nation to a parasitic speculation nation. This is an economy that chooses short-term arbitrage over long-term value creation.
Right.
When it becomes more profitable to bet against the national currency than to engage in the hard, productive work that backs the currency, the state capacity has evaporated. That, as Farhad notes, is the moment a nation loses its true sovereignty.
So let's provide the evidence of this structural decay. How is this deindustrialization manifesting in the long-term investment data?
The evidence is conclusive, starting with the investment crisis. Gross fixed capital formation, that's the money invested in new factories, machines, roads, infrastructure, fell by 4.3% in the period we analyzed.
Which means the country isn't even replacing its existing assets.
It's failing to replace or upgrade them. Investment levels in 2019, according to historical data, were already the lowest in 2 decades. This isn't just a stagnation, it's a sustained, systemic process of asset decay. The productive infrastructure is literally aging out without renewal.
So the output is shrinking, the workforce is leaving, and the machinery is simultaneously grinding to a halt because it's not being replaced.
Yeah.
But if there is investment, you mentioned it's highly concentrated.
Oh, it's heavily skewed towards short-term resource-based advantage. Our sources highlight that 6 core resource-based activities, chemicals, base metals, refining, non-metallic minerals, food production, and vehicle manufacturing account for approximately 80% of industrial value added.
And these are all dependent on cheap energy.
They are dependent on the state's massive cheap energy supplies and available raw resources.
This makes the entire structure incredibly fragile, reliant on a resource advantage that, as we discussed earlier, is itself eroding due to the gas paradox.
The industrial structure lacks diversity and resilience. It is highly susceptible to external shocks, whether those are sanctions targeting specific sectors or, more critically, the domestic failure of cheap energy supplies. This industrial structure is essentially trapped in a low-value, high-volume model, failing to transition into knowledge-intensive, high-tech sectors that provide resilient, diversified export earnings.
And we see this fragility reflected in their global competitive edge.
The low-value, non-diverse export structure is visibly weakening. The share of industrial exports from total exports is falling, dropping from 45% to 39% between 2017 and 2020. This is now 2/3 below the global average.
So they're getting less value for what they sell.
They are trading massive volumes of resources for relatively low returns, and the value they derive from these lower-value exports is plummeting relative to the higher-value capital goods they desperately need to import to keep their machines running.
Let's turn back to Farhad's ultimate concern, the human capital flight, the brain drain, because this represents the permanent loss of future state capacity.
The human capital crisis is a long-term economic wound that cannot be easily stitched up. The scale is staggering. The share of educated immigrants has tripled since 1979. This is a sustained hemorrhaging of talent across nearly 5 decades.
And the talent that is leaving is the nation's innovation capacity.
The data supports that perfectly. Between 2007 and 2012, an astonishing 96% of patents registered by Iranian-born inventors were filed outside the country.
96%, that's almost everyone.
This isn't just individual migration. It is the national innovation engine relocating abroad, taking all the spillover effects, the creation of new businesses, the training of new workers, the technological leaps with it.
What is the estimated cost of this intellectual exodus?
Estimates place the annual cost of this loss between $50 billion and $150 billion. Even taking the conservative $50 billion figure, that represents an enormous permanent economic loss, a figure that dwarfs the current government deficit figures and estimated cost of the subsidized dollar program. This is the opportunity cost of systemic failure.
And this exodus is fueled by deliberate policy choices that demonstrate a fundamental deprioritization of knowledge and education in favor of security and ideological control.
The budget allocation sends an unmistakable signal about the state's priorities. In 2023, funding for the IRGC, the primary security apparatus, increased by a phenomenal 200%.
200%.
Compare that dramatic increase to higher education, which received only a nominal 13% budget rise. Given that official inflation was running at 50%, that 13% nominal rise is, in real terms, a massive budget cut to universities and research institutions.
So when you quadruple the security budget and effectively slash the education budget, you're actively choosing immediate control over future prosperity.
It creates a moral failure that drives talent away. The state is telling its brightest minds, its engineers, its scientists, that their productive capacity is valued less than military and security control. This harkens back to ideological stances that viewed intellectual independence with suspicion, translating into long-standing policies that treat technocrats and educated professionals as potential threats rather than vital assets. The consequence is that the capacity needed for future economic growth has already evaporated, replaced by a speculative, rent-seeking culture. We've established that the physical core of the economy is atrophying and the financial system is leaking capital. Now we have to connect these failures to the political institutions that enable them. The overarching political concept here is vetocracy.
Vetocracy.
A governance structure where internal veto points and factional disputes prevent effective decision-making and reform.
So governance gridlock is essentially preventing any structural solution from even being proposed, let alone implemented. How does this paralysis manifest in the political system, especially regarding economic appointments?
It manifests as relentless, purposeful obstruction. Hardliners within Parliament weaponize legislative tools, often focusing on issues like dual nationality or family ties abroad, to obstruct and delay the president's cabinet appointments. We saw this specifically when nominees, even for critical posts like economy minister, were targeted.
So it's not a healthy debate. It's just a battle for leverage.
It's a constant, energy-consuming battle for political leverage that ensures no reform-minded, technocratic candidate can secure a smooth path to power.
I recall the supreme leader had to publicly intervene, which speaks to the severity of this internal paralysis.
It was a very telling, rare public rebuke. He urged lawmakers to cooperate and ease up on questioning and summoning ministers, stating that in a period of intense economic and international tension, such internal obstruction was counterproductive. He insisted the country needed to speak with one voice.
But it didn't really work.
But the core mechanism of political influence is obstruction. Factions assert power not by building new policy, but by exercising their veto over the appointments and policies of rivals.
And this gridlock feeds directly into the dominance of rent-seeking behavior we saw with the subsidized dollar. The failure to modernize the economy is ultimately rooted in political incentives, not just technical incompetence.
Absolutely. The failure to achieve diversified, sustainable industrial development is rooted in political economy issues, inappropriate institutional structures, the continuous expansion of state and quasi-state ownership, and, most critically, political power influencing industrial policy for private gain. The resources flow not to efficiency or merit, but to connection and political favor.
So those highly concentrated resource-based industries, auto, steel, petrochemicals that we identified earlier, they are powerful not just because of their scale, but because they have achieved what economists call regulatory capture.
That is the perfect term for it. These large entrenched industries have the political connections necessary to lobby successfully and maintain protective, inefficient policies. This ensures they continue to receive huge subsidies, specifically in the form of cheap energy and preferential currency allocation.
So the system rewards them for being inefficient.
This institutionalized rent-seeking provides massive incentives for them to focus on resource extraction and short-term profits, rather than investing in technological advancement, efficiency, or global competition.
Effectively, the political system is actively rewarding inefficiency because inefficiency benefits the politically connected.
Yes. The high concentration of investment in these limited sectors, often against sound regional or national economic logic, is a direct result of political demands from powerful local and central actors, leading to massive overcapacity in certain sectors while the core infrastructure decays.
This inherent political corruption is something the general public is acutely aware of, which accelerates the collapse of the social contract and trust.
The high-profile corruption scandals serve as public confirmation that the hardships are not borne equally. The arrest of family members of top cleric Kazim Sadeghi, who heads the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue, was a defining moment.
Right, I remember this.
This same cleric had previously been accused of unlawfully acquiring a $20 million plot of land. While he apologized for negligence and claimed forgery, he remained in his high-profile post, only for his family to be arrested later on other charges.
The optics are just devastating. The figurehead for virtue and moral policing is himself embroiled in massive corruption.
And when the law is finally applied, it often seems to be aimed at his extended network, confirming that the system is rotten at the core. A senior lawmaker openly acknowledged the consequence, stating that this behavior has created widespread distrust in society. People observe the children of officials, who once possessed very little, now owning ships, planes, and industry monopolies.
And that confirms the perception that the elite benefit while everyone else pays the price.
It confirms the widespread public perception that the elite benefit disproportionately from the state's resources and the subsidized currency system, while the average person bears the burden of inflation and decay.
Let's bring this political instability back to the productive economy. What happens when the operating environment shifts entirely from predictable risk to absolute uncertainty?
Private sector leaders warned the president that prolonged political and external tension has achieved exactly this shift. Risk-taking, where outcomes can be calculated, is replaced by complete uncertainty, where political gridlock or a sudden shift in foreign policy can erase an investment overnight.
So you stop investing.
This climate paralyzes the entire productive sector, which relies fundamentally on predictability, stability, and the rule of law. If you can't calculate the cost of doing business next month, you don't invest today.
And the government must pay for this political and strategic instability. If the economy is contracting and tax revenue is low, they are financing this paralysis through borrowing and deficits.
The budget tells the final story of political priorities. The government is shifting fiscal pressure into the future through substantial borrowing, signaled by a 25% rise in bond issuance. But the most critical insight is how the state is balancing its current account. It is aggressively stripping public subsidies from energy to basic goods, while simultaneously increasing the budget for security and defense.
So the state is forcing the public to bear the entire financial burden of the state's strategic choices. They are paying for the military and security expansion through higher prices at the grocery store.
Exactly. The public's economic distress is not an accident. It is the calculated, direct cost transferred to the populace to maintain the state's strategic and security priorities. The state is desperately attempting financial repression, closing down crypto-material gateways, imposing price caps, controlling currency transactions, all the monetary theater. But this unreal finance is failing to mask the persistent decay of real output. The structural problems, the broken gear, the dark factory, remain unsolved.
This deep dive has shown us that the real value of the currency is decided not by the central bank's simulations, but by the physical capacity of the economy to produce. What we have witnessed in this deep dive is a brutal economic autopsy, and it confirms that the dramatic exchange rate collapse is not the cause, but the final, stark valuation of a state that forgot where true power resides.
The crisis is a consequence of a comprehensive state capacity failure, rooted in the long-term atrophy of physical reality. When you can no longer consistently generate a kilowatt hour, maintain your essential infrastructure, retain the engineers necessary to build new capacity, or allocate capital fairly, your currency loses its foundation and its credibility.
The strength of a national currency is measured not by the rhetoric of its central bankers, nor by the digits in its foreign reserves, but by the physical and engineering prowess of its real economy, the power to keep its machines turning efficiently, to ensure consistent electricity supply, and to foster a culture of production rather than speculation.
And the loss of that engineering soul? And the atrophy of the physical infrastructure is the ultimate price reflected in the rail's collapse.